started. And I'm going to turn things over to Fan Li.
Thanks, Daniel. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to get started. My name is Fan Li. I'm an assistant professor of biostatistics at Yale University. It's a great pleasure to be here and talk to us about recent developments in statistical methods for step-to-edge cluster randomized trials. At any point in the presentation, please feel free to ask me any questions if you want to, hopefully I can get to it. The slides are all available online, so you should be able to download it at any point. So as we probably are familiar with, the cluster randomized trials, or CRTs, are study designs that allocate entire clusters of individuals to intervention or usual care. Each cluster may include a hospital, a nursing home, or a clinic, and these designs are conducted to minimize contamination of treatment within the same cluster, or because it is administratively convenient to randomize the intervention, which is designed to be a cluster-level intervention. The cluster randomized trials often come in the form of a parallel design where half of the clusters are going to be randomized to intervention or usual care at baseline simultaneously. However, a recent design variant called the step-to-edge design, SW design, rolls out the intervention in a staggered fashion, where each cluster as the unit of randomization will start at baseline, which is the control period, and then sequentially randomize or transition to receive intervention until all the clusters are exposed under the intervention. On the right-hand side of this figure, we are presenting a standard step-to-edge design with 8 clusters over 5 periods, where all the clusters start from the control condition, and then 2 clusters will be randomly selected in the following period to transition from control to intervention. And each of the time point where a transition happens is called a step or a wave, and the outcome measurements are taken in each period for each cluster in this design. So when is a SW-CRT a good study design choice? There is a really nice paper in International Journal of Epidemiology published recently talking about 4 broad justification of using SW-CRT design, 2 of which are more operational, including the facilitation of cluster recruitment when the intervention is perceived to be beneficial with minimum harm. In practice, often cluster stakeholders may be more willing to participate if they know that the cluster will have a chance to be exposed under an intervention that may be effective during the study. Second, it may be logistically more feasible to stagger the rollout in the design instead of randomizing half of the clusters to intervention simultaneously in the baseline period. The next 2 rationale are more statistical. First of all, the SW-CRT provides a means to conduct a randomized evaluation with full rollout. In practice, there are many implementation studies that are conducted with a full rollout, but without that randomization mechanism. And SW-CRT introduces that randomization mechanism with the full rollout to help us better learn the effect of the intervention. And finally, in SW-CRT, we can conduct both the within cluster before-after comparison, as well as the between cluster comparison, as in a usual parallel cluster randomized trials, which can increase the statistical power as shown on the right-hand side of this figure, which presents that variance inflation factor between cluster randomized trials versus the step-to-edge cluster randomized trials. We can see that when the intra-class correlation coefficient, that's the axis, is not really too small, there may be a power advantage of the SW-CRT over the parallel CRT, and that's justifying the power, the choice of the SW-CRT. But SW-CRTs can also be prone to risk biases, which include identification and recruitment biases, which is common to all cluster randomized trials with post-randomization recruitment. This can happen when, individually, because we know that the treatment in each cluster is not blinded in these population level trials, it may be possible that individuals may select themselves into clusters that are exposed under intervention at an earlier time period versus a later time period, which can, cause some systematic differences between individuals in different clusters, thus hampering the treatment evaluation. There can also be complex secular trend, even in the absence of intervention, which may happen because of an ongoing concurrent intervention program that we may not be aware of. There is also risks associated with extremely small number of clusters in the study, which may lead to some statistical inference issues. And there may be other implementation challenges, including that the trial may require a longer duration, and then under a closed cohort design, we may have some issues in retaining individuals over a long time period. Given these pros and cons, I want to point out that the decision to adopt an SW-CRT deserves a comprehensive evaluation by weighing the potential benefits against the risks in each specific trial context. Right, moving on. So the goal of this talk is that if we proceed with the SW-CRT design, I want to introduce to us what are possible variants of the design, and then what are available methods and tools to help us in the design and analysis, which are two interconnected components of the trial. And some of the discussions are going to be based on this review paper I published in Statistical Methods in Medical Research, synthesizing these models for the design and analysis of these trials. We'll also touch base on what are recommended practices for these trials and possible remaining issues to be addressed. There are three major types of SW-CRTs, including the repeated cross-sectional design as well as the closed cohort design as shown in the slide. In a repeated cross-sectional design, in each period, we will be enrolling new participants from each cluster. And this can be done, for example, when we're taking a cross-sectional survey from a larger cohort, which we do not afford to measure simultaneously in a trial, or it can be the case where we have patients presenting for healthcare during different time periods, and they were naturally included or continuously included in a trial for a short exposure with a short-term outcome for evaluation. For example, the trial that motivates the methods for stepped wedge design, the Washington State Expedited Partner Therapy trial, is such a repeated cross-sectional design where certain women present themselves in the clinics during each period for the measurement of their chlamydia and gonorrhea status as the outcome. On the other hand, in a closed cohort design, we would be identifying a cohort at the beginning of the study and then schedules repeated follow-up outcome assessments for the same cohort during the entire course of the study. And for example, the study that investigates the impact of the exercise physiologist coordinated resistance exercise program on the physical function of people receiving hemodialysis is such a design where there will be a distinct patient cohort recruited in each clinic for repeated follow-up on their quality of life outcomes. Repeated cross-sectional design implicitly assumes that the observed population in the trial is representative of the target population we have in mind for the study. Violations to which may result in selection or recruitment bias. As we mentioned earlier, patients may actually select themselves into clusters once they know the time period each cluster transitions into intervention versus control, which may be an issue, but otherwise the repeated cross-section design is often operationally convenient and often used when randomizing facilities in the healthcare systems. In a closed cohort design, we may have to require a stronger effort in retaining participants because informative dropout or even patients' outcome truncated by death may lead to selection bias because those who remain in the study are generally healthier than those original cohort we identified in the beginning of the study. Except for that, in general, a closed cohort design can require a smaller total sample size compared to repeated cross-sectional designs due to the correlations between repeated measurements of the outcome from the same patient over time. There is also a third option called the open cohort design, which is really a mix of repeated cross-sectional and closed cohort designs, because we're allowing for the attrition of the members from the original cohort, as well as the addition of new members to the existing cohort. And the reference given in the slide talks about all of these variants into more details. So the unique features of SW-CRTs requires more complex considerations on analytical models than those for a traditional parallel cluster randomized trials with only maybe one single time period. The mixed effects models is frequently used as a model for the design analysis of SW-CRTs. And the essential ingredients of a mixed effects model is given in this model equation in the slide here, where we have a link transformed mean outcome that will be equated as a term to characterize the secular trend, which is basically the outcome trajectory in the absence of the intervention. How are the outcome going to evolve over time in this population if there is really no intervention going on? And then we add the intervention effect component, which describes how the intervention would modify that time trend. And finally, in these mixed effects models, we have random effects terms to account for clustering or the between cluster heterogeneity. And these models are widely accessible from the standard software. Literally, SAS and R can fit it very easily. And according to recent systematic reviews, they are most often used in analyzing SW-CRTs. Just to get a sense of what these models look like, we can look at the simplest discrete time linear mixed model for a continuous outcome, which is this model 1 given here, proposed by Hassan Hughes in a 2007 paper published in Contemporary Clinical Trials. This model is essentially a random intercept model for cross-sectional SW-CRTs, where Yijk, the outcome from individual K in period J from cluster I, is equivalent to an overall mean term mu plus the fixed categorical secular trend describing the time effect, as well as a time-adjusted overall intervention effect delta, where Xij here describes the intervention status of cluster I in period J. Alpha I here is a common random cluster effect for individuals in the same cluster, and then the error term is an individual level independent error. In this model, the between cluster heterogeneity is induced by that single alpha I term, the random intercept term, capturing the cluster-specific departure from the average outcome trend, but is assumed to be homogeneous across time periods and intervention sequences. This mixed effects model induces a simple exchangeable ICC structure as depicted on the right-hand side of this figure. We can define the ICC or intra-class correlation coefficient here as the proportion of the outcome total variance explained by the between cluster heterogeneity, which is the variance components of the random intercept, tau alpha squared. In this model 1, a common ICC parameter is implied for both observations taken within the same time period, as well as observations taken between two different time periods. As we can see from the right-hand side, each of the value in the diagonal block represent the ICC parameters for two observations measured in the same time period. And that's a common value alpha 0, for example, equals to 0.15. The off-diagonal values describe the ICC parameters for observations taken from two different time periods, and the same value is assumed for that ICC parameter. Because of the simple structure of this model, there has been sample size formulas and design effects that were derived to facilitate power calculation in the design stage. In reality, the within period ICC can be stronger than the between period ICC, and more flexible models should address the possibility that the strength of the correlations may decay over time. For example, if we maintain that same level of the within period ICC equals to 0.15, in these two examples, we're allowing for a potential decay in the between period ICC over the 5 periods, which we'll go into details now. So for example, this model 2 that appeared in the literature includes an additional random cluster by time interaction term in the model 1, where in addition to that alpha I term describing the between cluster heterogeneity, we have the Cij term act as a random cluster by time interaction describing the departure from each cluster period relative to the overall trend. And under this model, we would be implicitly differentiating the concept of the between period ICC alpha 1 from the within period ICC alpha 0, but the between period ICC alpha 1 can stay constant over time, as we have shown in the left-hand side illustrative figure, where we know that the between time ICC is smaller than the within period ICC. A useful concept to quantify the between period ICC decay is called the cluster autocorrelation coefficient, the CAC, which is the ratio of alpha 1 over alpha 0. In this example we give, it's literally 0.5, indicating that we have assumed that the between period ICC will be half of the within period ICC to allow for that decay. Again, because of the simple structure of this model, there has been analytical sample size formulas derived to facilitate power calculation for this model, but that requires the input of the CAC in addition to the within period ICC. Model 3 includes a more flexible random cluster by time interaction term by assuming that the collection of the cluster by time interaction in a specific cluster can follow a more flexible correlation structure. In this example, taken as the first order autoregressive AR1 structure, and we call this correlation model under this mixed effects model, the exponential decay ICC structure or ICC model. In this case, the between period ICC alpha 1 will decay at an exponential rate over time instead of staying to be constant. And the CAC here measures the rate of the decay per time period. And unlike the previous models, which may be easier to fit in current software, SAS and R, the exponential decay model can be more difficult to fit, especially, and is currently only available in SAS default options. And in R, you have to do some self-programming to get it done for estimation of the model parameters. So despite all these options we have, currently there is no consensus on how to choose the best fitting model yet in the context of SW-CRTs, but there were some generic rule of thumb that may be helpful and informative for designing studies using these models, including that under specifications such as omitting a necessary decay parameter can result in biases of the variance of the intervention effect. For example, assuming model 1, when model 3 actually holds, can underestimate the variance, leading to a too small p-value and the too narrow confidence intervals. Assuming model 2, however, when model 3 holds, will usually underestimate the variance, but can also go the other way around, depending on the strength of the correlation decay within period ICC, as well as the cluster period sizes, among other design factors. However, overspecification, such as including an unnecessary decay parameter, does not generally lead to bias and may be recommended as a conservative procedure for design calculations. There are also other possible extensions of the mixed effects model that we don't review, including those that include a random cluster level treatment effect to induce a random intervention component, as well as those allow for a cluster specific time trend models. Those models may be preferable as they can flexibly specify the random heterogeneity structure for each cluster if the concern actually arises. And most of these models can be easily fit in standard softwares, including SAS and R and also Stata. However, we should realize that the standard software output often uses the model-based variance for the mixed effects models, which can be biased if the random effects structure is incorrectly specified. And that's why one has to be careful in choosing these model variants, and then perhaps conduct some sensitivity analysis to see how the power in sample size estimates are going to be changing according to various assumptions. And furthermore, the interpretation of the treatment effect parameters may depend on the random effects structure in these type of models, especially for binary outcomes under a logistic link function, in which case the interpretation of that log odds ratio parameter for treatment comparison may depend on the specification of the random effects structure. In terms of the sample size calculation, we have to realize that the sample size algorithm in general can be more complex in the SW-CRT than the parallel CRT. This is because we naturally have more design parameters to worry about, including the number of clusters, number of periods, the cluster period sizes, as well as more than one ICC parameters. For example, if we do not choose model 1, we need the CAC parameter in addition to the within period ICC. And this alone is, this additional requirement has to be paid attention to in the design stage. There are some ongoing efforts in developing tools to facilitate sample size estimation for SW-CRTs. And I provide a select summary of these available tools for computing power based mostly on the mixed effects models. As we can see, there are R packages as well as data packages, but also a recent shiny CRT calculator that was published recently in International Journal of Epidemiology that actually accommodates models 1 to 3 that were mentioned previously, as well as their extensions to cohort designs. Furthermore, most of these packages, when it comes to binary outcomes, uses a linear mixed model approximation with a constant residual variance, which may be inaccurate in some design spaces. And only one of those packages, the SWD power package in R, as well as the associated SAS macro, correctly acknowledges the variance, the binomial variance structure with the linear mixed probability model that facilitates the accurate calculation with binary outcomes. So the sample size calculation in SW-CRTs require ICC and also CAC parameters for these more complex models, and these may not always be easy to obtain in practice. Usually we recommend to calculate these values using routinely collected data if they will be available prior to the study. The published trial reports, including ICC and CAC estimates for a similar population with a similar endpoint, can also be informative. For example, on the right-hand side, I'm showing an example where this is done for a particular study reporting various intra-class correlations as well as CACs specifically for an SW-CRT in this context. The databases or publications reporting list of ICCs may also be helpful, and there are ongoing efforts to do this. In our experiences, usually the ICCs for clinical outcomes may typically be no larger than 0.05. The process measures may have a larger ICC. The CAC estimates are relatively less reported, but for continuous health outcomes, a CAC from 0.6 and 0.8 may be a reasonable assumption. In any case, if these values are not directly available, it is recommended to explore a range of plausible values for sensitivity analysis and maybe adopt the conservative option to go for in the design stage. In relation to the ICC concept, there is something that I want to mention, which relates to CONSORT extension to SW-CRTs on the recommended practice and conduct of these trials. Specifically, one of the CONSORT extension item says that for SW-CRTs, we need to report for each primary and secondary outcome, the results for each treatment condition, the estimated effect sizes, and its precision, and any correlations or covariances, as well as time effects estimated in the analysis. This is because reporting the estimated ICCs, as well as perhaps their variances, can be informative for the planning of the future trials, without which the calculation of future studies may only be some guesses of those numbers. Currently, relatively few studies recognize the concept of the CAC in addition to the ICC parameter, and few empirical studies are currently available to inform and guide the choice of the CAC parameters, specifically for SW-CRTs. There is only one ongoing study that may appear soon, that will appear soon in the Journal of Clinical Trials, that actually studies the estimates of the various ICCs and CACs in the context of a cloud data bank study, including a number of SW-CRTs from the Monash group in Australia. So there is a relatively rich literature on SW-CRTs based on linear mixed models with a continuous outcome, as we have seen just now. With a binary outcome, one may pursue a generalized linear mixed models as a direct extension, and perhaps with a nonlinear link function for interpretations of the treatment effect parameters. Those models in general can require a more substantial effort in fitting, especially when it comes to more complex random effects structures, such as those with exponential decay component. The ICC parameters may also be defined as a complex function of the variance components in those models, and the interpretation can depend on the choice of the link function, and may be hard to standardize from a reporting perspective for future power calculations. On the other hand, the marginal models may be an attractive alternative because they offer a population averaged interpretation of the regression parameters, which may have implications for policy or public health interventions. These models also separately specify mean model as well as the ICC model, and the ICC parameters in a marginal model is often defined on the natural scale of the outcome, and so they may be easier to standardize the reporting from that perspective. Finally, even if the ICC model is misspecified in this marginal model framework, we can always apply that robust sandwich variance as a fix to account for model misspecification, and this fix is often available in existing SAS procedures such as SAS GLIMIX, the empirical option. The essential ingredients of a marginal model for SW-CRTs is generally generally not too different from the mixed effects models, except that we are specifying an separate working ICC model directly instead of inducing that model by using random effects assumptions. For example, on the right-hand side, we are giving two examples, where we specify the working ICC model for the nested exchangeable as well as the exponential decay correlation structures that we have visited earlier in the context of the linear mixed model. Once we have the marginal mean model, the generalized linear mean model, as well as the working ICC model, the estimation and inference of the treatment effect and ICC parameters for SW-CRTs can proceed via the method of the generalized estimating equations, or GE. While the usual applications of GE regards the ICC parameters as a nuisance parameter that we don't care too much about, unlike other contexts, we mentioned that ICC parameters are actually of interest in SW-CRTs for many reasons. In terms of the marginal model, whatever the link function of the mean model, the ICC model in the marginal regression approaches are often on the natural scale of the outcome, and so may be easier to standardize reporting and plug in for future sample size calculation. And to this end, there has been sample size formulas and algorithms that were developed for continuous and binary outcomes for several correlation models included including the nested exchangeable models, as well as the models with a decay component, and even their extensions for cohort designs, as shown in the two references listed in the slide. It is important to realize that for sample size calculations with continuous outcomes, the calculation based on the margin model with the GE approach are really no different from the linear mixed effects models, as well as those two models are compatible. Basically, you can always write out the marginal counterpart of a linear mixed models by transforming the variance components into the ICC parameters directly. With binary outcomes, the sample size and power calculation based on GE are currently only implemented in the SW-D power R package, as well as that corresponding SAS macro, which assumed only the nested and block exchangeable ICC models without introducing any further decay assumptions in the software. In addition to that, there are more software tools that are under development with a major focus on binary and count outcomes, and including that decaying correlation component to facilitate the design calculations. For example, we have a forthcoming Stata package that is integrated into the power command that can be used for this purpose, and a forthcoming SAS macro and R package addressing additional complications arising from potentially incomplete stepped wedge designs where there is no data collection in certain periods, as well as including the cluster size variation, which is a more pragmatic feature of these trials in the population level studies. While there are many conceptual advantages of carrying out design and calculation, design and analysis procedures based on marginal models in the stepped wedge cluster randomized trials, there may also be operational challenges in applying these models, including the choice of the working correlation model, which is an essential decision to make in the analysis stage, the computational scalability with enormous cluster sizes in pragmatic trials, if that may be a concern in cross-sectional sampling. While the robust sandwich variance is valid asymptotically with a large number of clusters, in reality, we may only afford a few number of clusters to randomize in SW-CRT, and there may be concerns on small sample validity of the robust sandwich variance as an inference option. And finally, we may be wondering about what are softwares available to actually simultaneously report the treatment effect estimates as well as the ICCs under the marginal model framework for SW-CRTs. So we will be working through each of these points to illustrate the state-of-the-art findings for SW-CRTs. First of all, in terms of the choice of the working correlation model, we can either choose the independence working correlation versus the nested exchangeable or exponential decay correlation model, which may be more realistic because they recognize the time-dependent nature of these SW-CRT designs. For the independence working correlation, it is generally computationally convenient to carry out the calculations under these assumptions. Essentially, it is unbiased for the estimation of the intervention effect, and the correlation is fixed by the sandwich variance in the inference stage. And there are many existing software that can carry out GE with an independence working assumption. On the other spectrum, these nested exchangeable or exponential decay working correlation models, they may require more computational effort in getting specifically those ICC estimates in the data, and there may not be as many softwares to do so. So one may shy away from that. However, our finding in terms of the comparison of these models suggests that the independence working correlation model can lead to a very inefficient treatment effect estimator, even with equal cluster sizes in the context of SW-CRT, as shown by the relative efficiency curve on the left-hand side. Essentially, a smaller value of the relative efficiency means that the independence working correlation model can lead to a larger variance of the intervention effect, which may translate into lower power. And this relative efficiency can also have important implications on designing SW-CRTs. For example, in this table, we present a set of the illustrative calculation of the required number of clusters in the Washington State EPT study to achieve 80% power under a wide variety of design configurations, such as the ICC value as well as the CAC value, and a list of the assumptions on the true correlation model. In the parenthesis, we present the number of clusters required under an independence working correlation, and outside of that parenthesis, we present the number of clusters required, assuming the true correlation. And it turns out that assuming an independence working correlation can often cost us more than twofold of the required number of clusters to achieve the same number, to achieve the same level of the statistical power for the same design, which suggests that we should avoid making that simplistic assumption for design calculations and also for the analysis, and recommends and actually favors the use of the more realistic multi-level working correlation model due to the potential efficiency and also sample size savings in the design stage. In pragmatic SW-CRTs, there may be situations where we have an enormous number of individuals presenting for healthcare in a specific period. For example, on the right-hand side, we present the number of individuals contributing in observation in the Washington State APT study for each cluster during each period. And it is known for a long time that estimating ICC parameters through the marginal model and the GE framework can be computationally challenging with large cluster sizes. And this is exactly the case in the Washington State EPT study, where the cluster size over all 5 periods range from 300 to over 5,000. And that requires the enumeration of more than 14 million residual cross-product terms to even formulate the second order generalized estimating equation to estimate the ICC parameters for these trials. Without access to any individual level covariates, we have tackled this issue and developed a new GE approach that takes only the cluster period summary statistic from each time periods, so that each cluster only contributes one observation per specific time periods. And then without compromising the ability to estimate the treatment effect as well as the ICCs along with their variances, but really circumvent the computational challenges with enormous cluster sizes in pragmatic trials. And this approach has now been recently implemented in our package called GE-CRT, which is freely available on CRAN. As we said, while the sandwich variance is a fix of the inference for model misspecification in GE models, the so-called sandwich variance may have biases if we have only a limited number of clusters, such as and the magic number defining a small number of clusters would be either 30 or 40. However, review of SW-CRTs only suggests that the median number of clusters for SW-CRTs is only roughly 20.5. That means relevant bias corrections of the sandwich variance may be relevant to improve the validity of the inference in these trials. And this topic is an active pursuit, even for parallel cluster randomized trials, with many options, including those given in this table as an option. And the investigations on the bias-corrected sandwich variance were also pursued in recent articles for small-stepped wedge cluster randomized trials with roughly converging recommendations on what to consider for the analysis. For example, this figure summarizes several studies from a paper published in Statistics and Medicine, prior studies that investigates what are the recommended bias corrections of the variance parameters, as well as the degrees of freedom in small stepped wedge cluster randomized trials. In terms of the software tools for fitting marginal models in SW-CRTs, there has been widely used routines available in SAS and R to fit marginal models and GE for a general purpose. However, those procedures may not always take the two-level correlation model in their default options, and so they may also not always come with small sample corrections. We can see from the right-hand side where we summarize a list of the possible options that we have for the analysis of SW-CRTs using any of these routines. But we can see that usually a lot of the routines were not developed specifically for SW-CRTs because they may not handle more advanced multi-level correlation models, such as the exponential decay models for SW-CRT, except that the cluster period GE approach that were developed and implemented in the R package GE-CRT that could handle the various correlation models we mentioned earlier in the slide, but currently this package only implements the estimation and inference for binary outcomes with a logistic link function, and more components need to be developed in the future. So we have given a tour of what are possible options for the analysis and design of the SW-CRTs. But I want to acknowledge that there is currently no consensus, again, on the best models for design and analysis of these trials, even if we have many options. The mixed effects models and marginal models each have their pros and limitations, and the choice of these models can depend on the desired interpretation as well as the research question of interest. The methods themselves are not really competing with each other. They offer complementary approaches to tackle the same problem, and hopefully, in conjunction, they can offer converging messages for treatment evaluation. What's more important is that we need to consider valid small sample corrections to maintain valid inference, because usually these trials only come with a limited number of clusters. And for the CONSORT extension of the SW-CRTs, it is recommended to report ICCs as well as a clear description of the model specifications for these trials. In any case, it is highly recommended to work with a team, including a stats person, to figure out these details in the design stage. Before we end this talk, I want to mention two common misconceptions for SW-CRTs by an important slide I stole from my colleague Monica Taliad. The first misconception is that by choosing a stepwise design, I can avoid logistical challenges. While stepwise designs have advantages, as we mentioned earlier, they may be challenging also to implement because we have to ensure that all sites adhere to the same implementation schedule as we pre-specify. And the trial can increase the total duration of the study compared to a parallel cluster randomized trials. SW-CRT can also be vulnerable to external interferences such as pandemics or ongoing other concurrent interventions. And there may be an increase in the burden for data collection for trials involving closed cohort. The second misconception is that I can run my cluster or stepwise cluster randomized trials with only 4 clusters as long as my power calculation shows that I have enough power. While there are small sample corrections that improve inference in a small sample setting, I want to mention that there are relatively few simulations showing that with only 4 clusters, we could actually achieve valid power under those small sample corrections coupled with the inference approaches. And the 4 cluster issue may only be the case if we made a simple assumption where we are using model 1 by ignoring any potential correlation decay. And so this practice may be cautioned in terms of what would be a sufficient number of clusters to conduct a stepwise cluster randomized trials. And finally, I want to mention that, as an entry point to the evolving literature of SW-CRTs, there are several good references, including 2 International Journal of Epidemiology paper talking about conceptual choices on the stepped wedge cluster randomized trials for the specific study of interest, as well as a tutorial on power calculation for these more complex trials. The meta review article also discusses and synthesizes various models that has been proposed for stepped wedge cluster randomized trials in the past decade, a useful resource of reference. And so here is a list of references in the talk. Thank you for listening. I think we're out of time, and I appreciate any comments or questions at this point. So Daniel, are we allowing any questions at this point?
Sure, we've got, so the next session starts in about 13 minutes. So if anyone wants to throw questions in the chat, we've got a couple minutes, I think.
Sounds good. I was wondering I may be out of time, but it's great. We're allowing for questions. Thank you. I think we got one question from Elizabeth and asking how sensitive is the CAC to small sample sizes. And I want to mention that the power calculation will be sensitive to the CAC values because these CAC values are a measure of the correlation between time periods. And you know, a design usually can have multiple time periods. And so a small change of the CAC values means that we may have information, we may have assumed different information as to how these serious measurements are going to be correlated in the design. So I think regardless of small or large sample sizes, typically in a stepped wedge cluster randomized trials, the power may be sensitive to CAC values. The next question is that I wonder how much a CAC may be trusted for planning a large study when you've estimated perhaps from a smaller study. So that's a really, really good question, because I guess we don't have enough estimates that people report from empirical studies for CAC. And so one might want to say, you know, use a pilot study with a very small sample size to estimate CAC. But I would say that the danger of doing that is the uncertainty of the CAC may be very large if we get that estimates from a very small study. So that could lead to inaccurate calculation of the sample size for the larger definitive trial. And that's also why it has been encouraged, I think, to actually study the ICC estimates in larger studies, including you know, the databases that are currently available, including multiple SW-CRTs with sufficient sample sizes, or just to have a more systematic study on the ICC parameters for existing or ongoing studies, as one of these published article has done, which would include a sufficient sample size in general. And I think there's another question. I think, Donna, you've given me a question asking, has there been any work in adaptive SWDs where the correlations are re-estimated once the study starts and more data are accrued and the SWD redesigned accordingly? I think the answer is, so in practice, I know that people have done it like in actual trials, but I'm not really aware of any methods work that tackles this issue. There are several papers that talks about how to do re-estimation of sample size in parallel cluster randomized trials, but not specifically in SW-CRTs. So that would be a really great topic to investigate for sure. And also, you're free to post any questions on the forum for discussion if you want at a later time as well. So.
And those conversations on the forum will, of course, continue throughout
Right.
the conference.
And I figured out how to use it, so that's great.
Great. So yeah, I think we should give people a few minutes just of break between now and the next session. So I'm going to go ahead and